Just to clarify very briefly, I'm the link between the scientific committee and the organization, so I'm very much a political animal, not just a scientific animal. I'm going to try and be quick in my introduction here. So, with the UN recently having recommended decriminalization as a sort of best practice, at least the executive board, I think it's fair to say that the decriminalization debate is almost decided, or basically decided by now. The debate on what some people call legalization, how to regulate the drugs themselves, is a very different matter. And I think there are some issues that plague this debate that did not plague the debate on decriminalization. First of all, I think that the legalization debate is plagued by a conflict of priorities. The advocates of legalization, they tend to emphasize the importance of reducing the black market, for instance. They emphasize the importance of subjecting the drugs to quality control, to opening hours, to age limits, to taxation to pay for harms, arguing that, in essence, a legal market always provides more control with a substance than an illegal market, an illicit market does. Now, the opponents of legalization, on the other hand, are concerned with other things. They're much more concerned with the public health ramifications. They argue that it's very likely that legalizing a drug will increase use, and that the increased use will lead to increased excessive use, harms, problematic use, etc. They show to our experience with alcohol, with tobacco, with legal recreational drugs in support for this claim. Now, those advocating legalization, they tend to counter this today by saying that, look, any harms from legalization are dwarfed by the harms of continuing our ways of prohibition. They also argue that the harm from the drugs themselves might be mitigated if the drugs are subject to purity and quality and strength control. And those arguments may be valid, but to many people those arguments are not reassuring. A second problem, I think, in this debate is that we tend to argue in a very dichotomous fashion. The alternative to prohibition, legalization, is just one thing. Legalization is just one model. And it looks a lot like what we have for alcohol and tobacco today. So in the next much less than half an hour, unfortunately, I'm going to try to talk about a model with which I think drugs could be regulated that addresses these quite legitimate concerns about legalization, and also tries to show that there are many different ways of envisioning legal distribution of a drug that look nothing like what we have for alcohol and tobacco today, and that I think could address some of the problems that plague the legal regulation of those drugs. So I've chosen to call my talk, "Should Drugs Be Regulated Like Gambling?" which is sort of clickbaiting. But you will understand why eventually I chose this title. The title is not so important as the message. First, let's quickly have a look at the standard model, so to speak, to borrow a term from physics. What are we doing today with legal recreational drugs like alcohol or tobacco? So we have a universal model for regulation, and it's primarily based on price. What this means is that each unit of the drug, at least of the same potency, is equally taxed, and it's equally available, at least to all who are adults and legally able to buy it. The availability is limited mostly by thresholds. By that I mean that the likelihood of a purchase occurring is limited, but how much you purchase at a time is, for the most part, not regulated at all. The only ceiling on consumption over time is price, and price is the primary regulatory device. So affordability limits how much people consume over a given period. This gives rise to a couple of descriptive models that I think are key to understanding the objections to legalization. The first of which being the Pareto rule, which is of course not unique to drug policy. But in drug policy, the Pareto rule manifests itself as a very heavily skewed distribution of consumption. 20% of the consumers are responsible for 80% of the consumption, roughly speaking. Whereas 80%, the 80% who are consuming the least, are responsible for only 20%. We see also a 50-10 distribution. 50% are consuming only 10%, whereas the 10% consuming the most are consuming half or more. And in some countries, the 5% who are consuming the most are consuming well over a third. This is true for alcohol, and it seems to be true also for many illicit drugs. This means that any increase in consumption that might occur with, for instance, legalization, the brunt of that is going to be borne by the excessive consumers. And it also means that we will have a predatory industry, at least with the price system that we have today, because the industry derives the vast majority of its profits from people who have a harmfully high level of consumption or even dependent on a drug. The second descriptive model that this paradigm gives rise to is the total consumption model. This is very central to Nordic alcohol policies and also, I guess, world alcohol politics today. It tells us that when the average consumption or the total consumption increases, excessive consumption, so the number of people consuming to excess and the amount that they consume increases by a lot more. Actually, the amount of excessive consumers increases by the square of the increase of the average, which is quite dramatic. At least that is what the theory dictates. It's not always true, but it's approximately true. And this is also true when the average is measured only among the moderate consumers. And that tells us that this is not just some mathematical artifact, owing to the fact that the excessive consumers contribute to the average. It occurs independently of the excessive consumers contributing to the average. And it tells us, of course, that if the average is higher, so when consumption increases in society, the consumption becomes even more skewed. So the excessive consumers bear an even bigger brunt of this increase. The final of these three models is what's called the prevention paradox. This is also from epidemiology. And in drug policy, the fact that a small risk applied to a great number of people yields a significant occurrence of that risk coming into fruition, of something happening, tells us that a significant amount of harm is actually caused by moderate consumers. Some argue that the majority of harms from alcohol, for instance, comes from the moderate majority. It sort of depends on how you define that majority and also how you define moderate. Because a lot of this harm, especially for alcohol, comes from binge consumption. So a lot of it is violence and accidents, sexual assaults, et cetera, and also absence from work. And a lot of this is related to people having consumed a lot in a single occasion, a single sitting. But of course, universal regulation is not that effective at preventing binge consumption. In fact, some of these thresholds we use to limit availability could actually encourage binging or stockpiling and so on. And this tells us that the increase in normal consumption, when the average increases, can be significantly harmful in itself, at least with the current paradigm. Now I'm going to go into some non-standard models, if you will, that are availability-based. And it doesn't say so here, but you could say that the alternative to universal regulation is individual regulation. So these are individually regulated models. Two of them exist today, rationing and self-limiting. The two that I have an asterisk next to don't exist today as far as I know. They are being described for the first time now. So rationing, I've also called it quotas, is basically flipping the model on its head and saying that instead of having price as the primary limiting device, we use a quota. Normally it's been a monthly quota. This has been done with alcohol in Sweden and Greenland. Currently it's being done in Spitsbergen because it's not subject to Norwegian tax law. And it's also done with cannabis in Uruguay and in the cannabis clubs in Spain and some other countries. So basically, because a quota limits how much you can purchase and therefore also consume within a certain period of time, the price can be low because a high price is not necessary to limit consumption anymore. When Sweden abolished rationing of alcohol, and this was only strong alcohols, this was strong wine and spirits, in 1955, the incidence of cirrhosis death, so death from cirrhosis of the liver, increased by 50% in the following years, even though they replaced the low prices with high prices and even increased the prices later on to compensate for this increasing cirrhosis mortality. The researcher Tone Nordström has written a great paper on this in 1987, showing that basically what rationing did was it changed the skewing of the consumption so that the total consumption was concentrated more with the moderate consumers, whereas the excessive consumption fell quite dramatically. If you compare this to constitutional prohibition on alcohol in the US, you see something very interesting, because also there's research on the effect on cirrhosis mortality. And the effect on cirrhosis mortality of rationing in Sweden seems to have been 1.5 to 3 times greater than the effect of total prohibition of alcohol in the US, which is quite astounding. And again, this was accomplished without reducing the moderate consumption, without reducing the normal consumption. In fact, it did the opposite. I'll talk about that after. Rationing probably has a very unique effect on black market sales as well, at least in theory. I think it's reasonable to say that in Sweden, the black market did not increase because otherwise cirrhosis mortality would have been maintained. It became more difficult to obtain alcohol for those consuming the most. But if the quota is sufficiently high and the price is sufficiently low, then inarguably, the majority will be satisfied, at least if the product is good. They have no interest in the black market anymore. But also those who do have an interest in the black market because they consume too much, so more than the quota, will at least exhaust the quota before going to the black market. Because as long as the price is low, there's no incentive to buy illegally before they've bought all that they can legally. So you also cut into the consumption of someone who is still buying in the black market. Whereas today, if someone's buying alcohol illegally in a country like Norway, for instance, where alcohol is very expensive, they should buy everything illegally, because then everything will be less expensive for them. There's also a gray market effect with rationing, both in Sweden and also in Greenland, where they had this voucher-based system instead of a personalized sort of book that you had to write in. You see that when people exhaust their quota, when they run out of their own quota points, they go to their friends and ask if they have any leftovers. And of course, this undermines the system, but only to some extent, because it's very ineffective, and you have to approach a lot of people in order to obtain a large amount. But this is a buffer against the black market, of course. Acts as a brake. This diversion dynamic also limits underage access, and it does so quite dramatically, because any diversion of legally bought drugs to a minor occurs at the expense of the buyer's own access. If I only have so many units of a drug that I can buy every month, then I have even less that I can pass on to someone else, unless I'm not using any of it by myself, then I have just that amount. You would have to approach, you have to have a lot of people cooperating together in order to divert a large quantity. And of course, this is an individually regulated system. Everyone is registered somehow. So if you're caught diverting, then you can have your buying privilege revoked, which sounds a bit ridiculous today with, that doesn't happen with alcohol regulation, but this can happen in rationing systems. Like the cannabis clubs, for instance, in Spain. That's grounds for expulsion from a cannabis club. It also does something interesting to industry motives, because when you limit the amount of a product that each consumer can buy, you also limit the amount of profit the industry can make off of that consumer. It means that extreme consumption, at least consumption past the quota, is no longer profitable to the industry, which means the industry is no longer, I'm not going to accuse the industry of doing this today, but everybody knows they do it, but they have no incentive to create heavily dependent consumers. They do have an incentive to maximize the normal consumption within the quota, but that's a different story. You can also use rationing to address binge consumption, which is the core of the prevention paradox. Because you can have different quotas. You can have a monthly quota, which is the basic one, but you can have a 24-hour quota as well. You can say that you have to go a certain number of times in the month in order to fill your monthly quota. This would limit stockpiling, which is a big problem today. People have they have to travel far to the store to get alcohol, or they have to cross the Swedish border to buy a huge amount, so they stock up as much as they can. But if you limit this, then they don't have as much lying around at home, and they don't drink as much every time, or they don't smoke as much weed, or whatever we're talking about. You can also have a serving quota. So in nightlife, imagine you go to a bar, and the moment you walk in through the door, there's a number. That is the number of units you're allowed to buy that evening. No more arguments with bartenders over why they're not giving you any more beer, presumably. You could be unreasonable, of course, and still argue. And the amount of excessive intoxication would most likely be limited severely. If we're talking about alcohol specifically, I'm not talking about any specific drug today, but then, of course, you could have some system where if you're buying a round for your buddies, then your buddies just transfer their points to you, and then you can buy on their behalf, so you don't have to spend of your own quota. But we're probably not talking about alcohol here. You can even envision a sort of quota where polydrug consumption is regulated with points, like they had in Greenland for alcohol. So one drug can be worth one amount of points, and the other can be worth another. So when you're spending points to buy one drug, then you're not just restricting the access to the other drug, but you're also doing so disproportionately because one is more harmful or less harmful than the other, presumably. You can also use this to prevent dangerous drug combinations if it's a serving quota. So let's say alcohol and GHB are both legal in nightlife. Then if you purchase alcohol in one night, then you can't purchase GHB in the same night or in the next 12 hours, and vice versa. The most common objection to rationing that I've encountered is privacy, because you have to be able to document your purchase history for at least the current period. You can solve this in a couple of different ways. One way is some kind of voucher system, either paper-based or digital, using various fancy technologies, where the buyer is holding the information, holding the purchase history, and this is not centrally registered. It just acts as a key when purchasing. There may be vulnerabilities to defrauding the system, but I think this is perfectly doable today. Another solution is pseudonymization, where either a third party scrambles the data so that the central registry does not know to whom they belong, but still guarantees the identity. A much simpler way of doing this would be, for instance, to have a biometric registry where you're not registered by name, but you have to register, say, the digit, a digit that you don't use for any other identifying purposes. So let's say you use your index fingers for biometric identification in all other places. At the cannabis club, or whatever other club, you use your ring finger. So nobody knows it's you. That's the only place you use it. Of course, you'd have to show ID when registering the first time, but they don't store this anywhere. I think the easiest way to get around this, though, is just to consider the fact that this doesn't have to be a state bureaucracy. Private clubs are microcosms based on rationing. And in Spain, for instance, people seem to be totally fine with approaching these private clubs. They're very, very popular. As opposed to Uruguay, where everybody has to register with the government, that's a completely different story. Much less compliance. Another objection that I'm not going to spend much time on is autonomy, because rationing is sort of the nanny state telling you can't buy more than this amount. This is an ideological objection, but it's also a pragmatic one, because if it's too unpopular, you're going to get a lot of circumvention, people trying to get around the system, scalping points and so on. But it can also easily be abolished. Let's say you have a populist government, and this is a system for alcohol, or maybe cannabis in the future when cannabis is equally mainstream. Then the populist government scores points by abolishing the system. I think one of the stronger objections to rationing is this. This is what we saw in Sweden when the rationing system was abolished. Rationing creates this FOMO effect, or loss aversion effect, where a lot of people feel obliged to use their quota's worth, like to exhaust it, so they don't miss out on the opportunity. Also, the low price combined with a quota that is not very low is a further incentive to maximize consumption up to a certain level. So what we saw in Sweden was that the number of people consuming very little to no alcohol was much less under the rationing system, even though the excessive consumption was also much lower. And it's also very difficult to decide a universal quota because of the skewedness of distribution. There's a very small group using a ridiculously high amount of a drug, whereas the majority are very moderate. Reconciling the two is a very difficult exercise. Another objection is that if you're going to have this low price, which of course is a huge benefit when competing with the illicit market, is that you're going to get less tax revenue. Less money, less tax. And politically, it might be difficult to justify. Sorry, I'm trying to be fast here. Because even though you may reduce black market harms, those are hard to quantify, they're hard to show people. So this might be unpopular. And for drugs that are really harmful and might still cause a lot of harm with normal consumption, you may not pay for the harms with the tax revenue. This might be the case with alcohol today. We're maybe not paying for the harms, even though we're cashing in on the tax revenue. So what are the alternatives? How do we reap the benefits of rationing without maximizing the normal consumption, without sacrificing personal autonomy, without reducing tax revenue, possibly? One of the core problems that we're dealing with here, and one of the reasons why today's price-based regulation is not working as well as we would like it to, is delayed reward discounting. This is a phenomenon in psychology or behavioral economics. We value immediate rewards over future rewards, and we're less price sensitive when we're craving. And when we're shopping something, usually we're craving a bit more than when we're not shopping that thing. And to people who have a tendency towards problematic drug use, this effect is stronger. With someone with dependence, it's very strong. And you could say that the consumption over time, how much we consume over time, is really defined by our weakest moments, because those are the moments where we make decisions that affect the consumption the most. There's a kind of solution to this problem in current gambling regulation models called self-limiting or precommitment. This is currently utilized by the Norwegian State Lottery and also some online gambling services, but there it's voluntary, whereas with the Norwegian State Lottery, it's mandatory. You have to decide your own limit or your own quota in this system. And you're held to that limit, meaning you can lower it freely. You can decrease the limit whenever you want, at least in some versions of the model. But you cannot increase, you cannot raise the limit or the quota until the period is over, so until the next period. What does this mean? Well, it means that only impulses towards moderation, towards decreasing, are heeded. But if you have an impulse towards increasing your consumption, towards excess, then that impulse has to be maintained over time. So it's no longer an impulse, it's a constant desire. This model was proposed in a paper in 2006 by John Bashirs and colleagues for tobacco and alcohol. This was before the time of apps. This was like some model based on an internet website, as they called it. But today, it seems like a more interesting model to explore. Just to clarify, this picture is of Odysseus in Greek mythology, who was the pioneer of self-limiting. He tied himself to the mast of his ship so that he could sail past the sirens and not be lured onto the rocks by their song. So, what can we say about self-limiting? Well, I would argue that self-limiting actually increases personal autonomy, because sure, it may limit your freedom to make some presumably regrettable decisions, but it increases your freedom from being exploited in moments of weakness. So the industry can no longer take advantage of people in moments of craving and make them consume a lot more than they otherwise would have wanted. There may be less desire to circumvent the system with this model, as you see from this survey done by the Norwegian State Lottery, where we see that the vast majority did not play, even though other providers of gambling are very easy to find, when they reached the limit that they themselves had set, rather than a limit that the system had set. The problem, though, is that this model does not allow low price the way that rationing does, because you have no guarantee that people are going to set this limit low. It has a much smaller effect probably on diversion, because anyone wanting to divert can simply increase their limit without any negative consequence to themselves. And one problem that I have not seen anywhere in literature, but that I suspect would arise if trying to apply this to drugs, is that the incentive for self-limiting with a commodity like recreational drugs is very weak. Most people do not think that it would be, or I think at least, they would not think it would be a big problem if they sometime spent a bit more on a drug than another time. And another bigger problem here is that there's stigma associated with self-limiting, because both the use of drugs and the purchase of drugs tends to happen in the presence of others. It's not this private, faceless activity like online gambling. And if you're denied service in some bar or in some store, then others will see you and they will think, why did you have to self-limit? Like, do you not have any self-control? This might be a big problem with such a model. So I said I would describe two models that have not been described before. I'm going to try and do that in 4 minutes. The first of which I've called discounted self-limiting. So basically, we take the self-limiting model from the gambling systems. We apply to it a progressive price. So the unit price, the price of each unit on the quota, follows the quota up and down. And this is a tax on availability, not on consumption, because it doesn't matter how much you actually buy. As we can see from these imaginary vouchers here, the top one being with a quota of 5 units costs 200 because each is 40. With the bottom one, the quota is 9. All of a sudden, the same 5 units cost 220 because each unit is now 44. The numbers are arbitrary here. This is just showing the concept. I need to crunch these numbers if I am to show what's optimal. Basically, this forces people to weigh the marginal utility of these last units on the quota, which are sort of distant in time, versus the cost of every unit, which includes the first ones that are near in time. I must stress, though, that this is not linear. It doesn't have to increase very far. It doesn't have to be very expensive for someone to have a high level of consumption. This is a discount. This is a negative bulk discount. So reducing your consumption is rewarded. But if you are someone with an excessive consumption, it doesn't have to become very expensive. At some point, we don't care anymore, give them a flat price. So the advantage of this is that any reduction in consumption will be rewarded. And this financial motive means that there's no stigma, because you can always say, I'm doing this to save money. This is financially rational to do, economically rational. You're likely to see increased price sensitivity, because we know that price sensitivity increases in moments of craving. But here, the decisions are not made in moments of craving. Or if they are, then any moment later on during the period where you no longer feel craving, you will reduce the limit, and that will take precedence. Diversion becomes expensive, so it's almost the same effect as with rationing. And you can always combine it with rationing and have a high upper limit so that any diversion past that point is impossible. But eventually, diversion becomes so expensive that there's no profit in diverting. And of course, we retain the tax revenue because of the Pareto distribution. The vast majority are consuming so little that they're also contributing very little in terms of tax. You could cut the tax revenue today in half on the 80% who are consuming the least, and you would reduce total tax revenue by only 10%. The second model that has not been described before, as far as I know, is sort of an adjunct to the one I just described. I've called it progressive profit limiting. This is where it gets a little weird. Because we have to regulate the price itself with the one I just described. So we have to say that the market decides the base price, but the increase is regulated. That means that you can also regulate the tax separately from the price. And when you do so, you can say that past a certain quota level, the unit tax increases by more than the unit price, which gives diminishing returns in terms of profit. So it's an indirect progressive tax on the potential profit per consumer. If you look at these numbers, what this means is that a moderate quota, so if you use everything on the quota, that means a moderate consumption, is more profitable than an excessive one. So as you can see, a quota of 15 is the point at which we no longer want anyone to be there. So at 14, you see the maximum possible total profit in the period. Let's say this is a month. Past that level, the profit total begins to decline, even though the quota and the consumption is increasing. This is a very weird thing, but as you can see, the numbers work out. So the unit tax percentage is increasing from 14 and on, from first 40, and then 45, 50, 55, etc. What does this mean? So first of all, it means that the tax revenue can reflect actual harm, because the harm from a drug is non-linear. So the next unit of alcohol, for instance, that you drink is much more harmful than the previous, by a lot. So selling a unit of a drug to someone with a high level of consumption does a lot more harm than selling it to someone with a moderate level of consumption. Today, that is equally profitable to the industry. This also penalizes the industry for skewing the distribution of consumption. So the more level the distribution, the more profit in terms of relative to the total consumption the industry can have. But it also gives the industry a possibility of increasing its profits by encouraging people to self-limit. Because the industry can no longer exploit people in moments of weakness to increase their consumption. They're sort of inoculated against that with the self-limiting model. But it can still manipulate them to make better choices. So if you see this ratchet here, I thought it was a good metaphor, because here you see the consumption and the quota and the profit that was in the table on the previous page, where there's like an optimal point at the top. the industry has no tool anymore to move consumption towards the right. It can only move it towards the left. So anyone to the right of the optimal point, the industry has an incentive to move towards the left to that point in order to maximize profit. So, is this applicable to the alcohol industry today? No, I think someone would assassinate me or whoever else suggested it if that were tried. But is it applicable to fledgling markets like legal cannabis in Norway or some other place where it doesn't exist yet? Just sort of limiting the growth of the market instead of trying to decrease an existing one? I think so. So, what would a possible model look like? I don't have all the answers, but just to sum up some of these elements in a vision of the future, so to speak. This can be done through distribution by private clubs, like the cannabis clubs that we have in Spain today, or something similar to that, where each club is its own system. But the government, through regulation, would probably want to limit multiple memberships. So maybe have some mandatory sign-up fees, waiting lists, licensing to prevent there from being too many clubs in the same area, etc. I suggest that the discounted self-limiting and progressive profit limiting would be applied to the monthly quota, and then you could have a separate discounted self-limiting system to the serving quota, and the 24-hour quota would just be a fraction of the monthly quota. And I think that at least if you want to be UN compliant with these club models, that, like the cannabis clubs in Spain, you need some upper limit. And then you could operate with age-differentiated limits. So people say below the age of 23, if the lower age is, the bottom age is 20, have a lower upper limit than people above the age of 23, or whatever arbitrary number. So those were the ideas I was going to present. Now I am finished, and I hope you enjoy Steve's lecture. Thank you.